I'm Rick Harp. This is your APTN News Brief for Wednesday, January 31st. We begin in Saskatchewan, where the inquest into the mass stabbings on and near the James Smith Cree Nation finished up Tuesday, sending the jury to deliberate. Rachel May has more.
Over the past 2.5 weeks, we've heard testimonies from various agencies and people connected to the tragic stabbing deaths on September 4th, 2022. The purpose of the inquest is not to assign blame, but to give recommendations to prevent similar deaths from happening again. We heard the presiding coroner, Blaine R. Bevan, explain what the jury needs to consider, as well as what is legally required when preparing their recommendations for change. A separate jury report will need to be made for each victim, providing their name and details around their death, and to make recommendations to prevent similar deaths. Family members who lost loved ones during the attacks spoke about their hopes for the recommendations. Chelsea Stonestand is a member of James Smith Cree Nation and said she hopes to hear recommendations about cultural programming.
When we look at the evidence that spoke to the programming within the Correctional Services Canada systems, it showed that there's a lack of ceremonies.
Joyce Burns was one of the attacked. She also lost her husband. She said being at the inquest has provided insight.
Especially this young man that did this crime, where he come from. And it opened my eyes.
Joyce said that she hopes Indigenous offenders get the chance to relearn their culture.
Just to teach them, our culture, to go back there and try and steer them on the right road.
Chief Robert Head of Peter Chapman Band, a member of James Smith Cree Nation, spoke about his hopes for recommendations.
We need to have First Nations policing recognized by Canada as an essential service.
We're expected to hear the jury's recommendations later this week. Rachel May, APTN National News, Melfort, Saskatchewan.
The fire, which destroyed a Northern Ontario school last week, came up in Parliament Tuesday. The incident on the Iabmutung First Nation saw police charge 4 youth with arson. It's renewed calls for more federal funding for fire trucks, equipment, and halls on northern communities, an issue NDP MP Charlie Angus raised in question period.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Another winter, another tragic fire in Treaty 9. Children at the Iabmutung First Nation have no school because it burned in a fire and they had no fire service. Last winter, Peawanuck lost a beautiful 10-year-old child to a fire, and this government's response was, well, we'll buy you a truck, but we're not going to pay for the fire hall. How do you do fire safety at minus 45 without a fire hall? Will the minister stop nickel and diming the people of Treaty 9 and commit for all the communities properly funded fire halls, vehicles, and a new school for the children of Iabmutung, because every child deserves safety and a comfy school. Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, I think all Canadians were so sad to hear about the fire that destroyed the school in Iabmutung. And I spoke with Chief at Lucan on Friday night to reiterate to the Chief that we'll work with the community not just on fire prevention, of course, the truck that's waiting for the ice roads to be delivered, but also to make sure that those students have a plan to complete their year of study here. I'll be meeting with the Chief and indeed the CEO of Matawa First Nations Tribal Council to be very clear about the support that our government will continue to provide to Iabmutung.
To Whitehorse, Yukon, where a new safety initiative hopes to help vulnerable people and those living on the streets. Sarah Connors has the details.
Yukon First Nations and Indigenous people are overrepresented in the homeless population.
On Thursday, this van will be hitting the streets of downtown Whitehorse to help vulnerable people in need. It's called Moccasin Mobile Outreach. The pilot project will be operated by the Council of Yukon First Nations and funded by Yukon government. It's part of an overall strategy aimed at providing culturally relevant supports to people in need, as well as enhancing safety in downtown Whitehorse.
We are currently working on getting some shelving and some updating and some other items done before we head out on the road.
The council says it's all about meeting people where they're at, which is why it's staffing the service with Yukon First Nations outreach workers.
I think it's really important that vulnerable populations see themselves reflected in the service, understand the historical trauma, the realities faced by Yukon First Nations. So it's really important to have a Yukon First Nations-led service.
So we have the clean crack pipe kits and clean injection kits, and there's a few more other...
The van will be well stocked with harm reduction supplies. People who use the service are welcome to take personal care items, hygiene products, warm clothing, and food. Workers will also be trained in things like naloxone and first aid and will be able to connect clients to other services like the RCMP or EMS.
Many of our people do not feel safe phoning the RCMP at times due to legacy and historical issues. So this is really an opportunity for us to provide those supports until the EMS or until RCMP arrive.
The service will operate Thursdays to Saturdays between 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. It will follow a designated route, which includes stops at the Whitehorse Emergency Shelter, bars, and parks. Hotels will also be a priority.
Many people are living in hotels that are on income assistance, so we want to ensure there's safety around that.
Funding will take the pilot project through until the end of March, though the council hopes to offer it for the foreseeable future if there's a need.
Our service is really meant to ensure that people are not dying on the street, freezing, and or being harmed.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
I'm Kathleen Martins, a reporter with APTN News. Homeless, houseless, shelterless people, they aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? Hear their stories in my new 5-part podcast called Our Relatives. Listen on your favorite player.
Turning to Edmonton, where an Indigenous journalist faces potential jail time. And yesterday, Brandy Morin reported to police service headquarters for fingerprinting. It follows her January 10th arrest at the site of an outdoor encampment, the removal of which Morin tried to cover when she was charged with obstructing a police officer. If convicted, she could face up to 2 years in prison. Several organizations have demanded the charges against Morin be dropped, saying media must be allowed to cover news in the public interest. Morin's first court appearance is scheduled for tomorrow. Alongside her lawyer, she spoke to the media just outside the police station.
I feel like my rights have been violated in this. It's been a horrible time. Like, I always knew that there was risk of arrest because of the type of stories that I cover. But until it happens to you, you don't understand the emotional and psychological impact that it has on you. And I think that it is a tactic that they use to send that message, to impede, to insult, discredit, and to intimidate the media.
And that's your APTN News Brief for Wednesday, January 31st. I'm Rick Harp.